My name is Kate Orkin. I'm a research fellow at the Centre for the Study of African Economies at the University of Oxford. I'm based at the Blavatnik School of Government. The Labour session today is being run by the CSAE's, the stream that works on welfare and behaviour, the Mind and Behaviour Research Group. So we're the team running things today with the CSAE conference team. I just wanted to start by thanking Fiona and Cara and the whole CSAE communications team for their amazing work. It's been a very slick conference experience, so thank you so much for everything you've been doing. I then wanted to introduce the two people from the group who are going to be helping with the session today. So Paul Brimble, who you'll see is a research assistant at the Mind and Behaviour Group, with a special interest in sort of machine learning and big data techniques. Marta Grabowska is also a researcher at the group with interest in health and political economy. And then finally, I just wanted to thank the chair, and I'll hand over to her. It's Assistant Professor Mahreen Mahmud. She was a postdoc at the Centre for a long time. She's just started work as an assistant professor at the University of Exeter, and is doing some really exciting work on women in a wide range of places, so female labour market participation, small business ownership, and also dynamics in the household. So thanks very much to her for chairing, and to all of our participants. We're really looking forward to having you.
Great, thank you so much, Kate, and welcome everyone. The session is on young people and women in the labour market, and I'm particularly excited that we actually have presenters from all over joining us today. And we're going to start by a presentation on the persistence and dynamics of youth unemployment by Godstime Eigbiremolen. So over to you, if you could please share your slides, and you'll have 15 minutes.
All right, thank you, Mahreen. It's great to be here today to talk about my research, which is on the persistence and dynamics of young people or youth in the labor market. So youth unemployment in most regions of the world continue to be a worrisome issue for policymakers, right? Because of the social and economic consequences. Now, the persistence of youth unemployment means that youths that experience unemployment are more likely to experience unemployment in the future. So persistence essentially means unemployment today gives birth to unemployment tomorrow. Now, it's not enough to simply identify persistence in the data. It's important to try to isolate the mechanisms that drive such persistence, because doing this is not just an academic exercise. It's essentially important for policy because each mechanism requires different policies. So the question is, why do young people stay in unemployment pool for a long time? Now, there are two different mechanisms that could actually cause this persistence in youth unemployment. So the first one could be that young people persist in unemployment because they are different. They're essentially different in terms of the observed and unobserved characteristics that they have. All right. So, for example, a young person may persist in unemployment because they have very weak preference for work, or they have low human capital accumulation. Now, if these factors persist over time, they will definitely induce state dependence between unemployment yesterday and unemployment today. But of course, such dependence is likely going to be spurious in the sense that it's going to, you are unemployed today, not because you were unemployed tomorrow. Yesterday, you are unemployed today, not because you were unemployed yesterday. Why you are unemployed is because you are different. You have factors that make you vulnerable. But of course, we are going to see some sort of state dependence, but actually it's a spurious dependence. And the second mechanism is young people who actually persist in unemployment because there's a causal link between unemployment yesterday and unemployment today. So the fact of being unemployed causes further unemployment. So of course, this is another form of state dependence, but this is what Heckman termed the true or genuine state dependence. Now, identifying which mechanism is in the data is important for policy, because as you can imagine, each of these mechanisms will require different policy. For example, if it's the first mechanism, you will want to use structural long-term policies. But if you could observe a causal link in the data, therefore, short-term policies like becomes relevant in this context, okay? Now, in the literature, actually, I discovered that studies that specifically looked at the mechanisms that drive persistence in youth unemployment are quite limited. So what you have in the literature is a bunch of works that look at persistence, but not mechanisms driving such persistence. So that means there is need for more studies. And even more worrisome is the fact that existing studies in the literature are predominantly in the context of developed countries. We don't have much evidence in the developing country context. So that's the motivation. So in this paper, what I do is I take data from South Africa, a panel data, which is 5 waves, so the CAPS. So CAPS is the Cape Area Panel Study. So I take this data for 2 reasons. Number one is that South Africa, among countries in sub-Saharan Africa, or even the whole world, currently has the highest rate of youth unemployment in the world. So that's quite worrisome. And secondly, because they have the kind of data that will allow me to do sort of a more in-depth analysis. So what I do is I take the panel data and estimate persistence of youth unemployment, employing a standard dynamic random effects model. So in my specification, I'm able to control for observed and unobserved factors, and then the initial conditions problem. I'll talk about the initial condition problem in a moment. So in particular, I use the Woodridge suggestion to obtain consistent estimates and differentiate true state dependence from spurious state dependence. So I find the existence of a causal link between past and current youth unemployment. So the fact of being unemployed yesterday causes unemployment today. So quickly, I present some descriptive statistics here. So what I do is I use both the balanced panel and the unbalanced panel. So the decision for that is to check how severe or how sensitive my results are to the so-called survivor bias. So that's why I'm using both balanced panel and unbalanced panel. So here, I just focus on the first row. Essentially, I'm just checking if we have persistence or the amount of persistence in the data. And from what we could see here, we have quite a reasonable amount of persistence. So conditional on unemployment at time t-1, you see current unemployment is relatively high, which is suggestive of persistence in the data. But like I mentioned before, we don't know essentially what is driving this persistence. Is it differences in observables and unobservables, or is this because there's a causal link between past and present unemployment? So to do this, I set up a very basic econometric model following Ruler et al. 2017. Essentially what I do, I set up the standard random effects model where unemployment depends on unemployment at time t, depends on unemployment in the previous time, a vector of observables and unobserved heterogeneity, and then a transition shock, okay? I then write a conditional probability of employment. So essentially what is important to me here is the scalar lambda. So the scalar lambda is a measure of persistence. So this is essentially what is important to me. Now, the problem I mentioned before, equation 1 and 2, assume that there's no initial condition problem. So essentially, the initial condition problem is quite a big issue in random effect analysis. So it's essentially the past history of the survey. So because the data I'm using, I don't have the pre-sample history. So equation 1 and 2 assume that the pre-sample history is exogenous in the model, but of course, which is not correct, because the past history, that is before the pre-sample history of the individuals in my sample, is likely going to be correlated with the unobserved heterogeneity that determines unemployment at time t. So if I ignore that component, it's going to cause inconsistent estimates. So to address this, I simply follow the advice or the model suggested by Woodridge 2005 and refined by Reb Haskett and Schronder 2013. Essentially, what they suggest is we need to integrate out the unobserved component and specify it as a function of the initial outcome, the initial value of the outcome variable, the average of the observables, and then the initial observable characteristics. So of course, then this is the joint density. If you look at this, it's similar to what you will have in a standard probability model. The only difference is just the inclusion of the average and initial values. Okay, so this is the model I estimate. I'm really running because of time. If there's anything, you can call me back. So now, so here is some results. So again, I focus, so these are the estimates of lambda. So these are the estimates of lambda that measures persistence. So column 1, so here I don't remove, I ignore the role of unobserved variables. So what I find in the data is quite a significant amount of persistence, okay? But in column 2, what I do is to take out the effect of unobserved factor. But what I see is a significant decrease in persistence. So which suggests that the persistence we see here is driven largely by differences in unobservables and observables. So when I isolate the effect of unobservable, I see a significant decrease in the amount of persistence. And this is also true for the unbalanced panel. So if I ignore unobserved factors, I see this, but when I remove the effect of unobserved factors, this is what is left. So suggesting that the significant or the large amount of persistence observed in the data is driven largely by unobserved factors. But of course, the important point is even when I remove the effect of unobserved and observables, there's still a significant amount of persistence in the data indicating the causal link between past and present unemployment. Okay, so here what I do, based on my results, so I calculate some predictions, sort of the steady state predictions. So what I do, I check the role of education in different outcomes. So entry probability, exit probability. For example, what I see is high school dropouts, for example, relative to those with at least a high school diploma, have higher entry probability into the unemployment pool, are less likely to exit the pool, have higher persistence, higher steady states. So steady state in this context means the proportion of time spent in the unemployment pool, and also have higher mean duration. So this is also true for the unbalanced panel, okay? So here what I do again is another way of identifying the presence of true state dependence. That is after I have removed the effect of unobserved factors. So what here essentially is doing the same thing. Here in this x-axis, I have a calibration of unobserved components. So unobserved component is broken into quantiles. Then if you look at it again, it's consistent with the previous results that conditional on unemployment at time t minus 1, unemployment at time t is significantly higher. So the probability of unemployment is significantly higher when we condition on unemployment at time t minus 1. That is after isolating the effects of unobserved factors and observables. Okay, so that is quite indicative of that causal link between past and present unemployment. Okay, so okay, I still have about 2-3 minutes. So at least so let me talk about the result in a nutshell. So I tried to really condense some of the things I did in the paper. So what I see first of all is that more than half of the persistence in the data is due to spurious rather than true state dependence. So this is very important for policy, right? So when you see people, most of the people that are in the unemployment pool are not there because they were unemployed. They are not unemployed today simply because they were unemployed yesterday. There's something different about them. There's something systematically different, either, like I mentioned, in their preferences to work or in their initial human capital accumulation. Now, however, after I remove the effect of unobservable, I still see a significant amount of true state dependence in the data. So we suggest the existence of a causal link between past and current youth unemployment. This is absolutely important for policy as well, because there are sets of young people in sub-Saharan Africa that are unemployed today simply because they were unemployed yesterday. It's not because they are different. It's not because, so the fact of being unemployed causes further unemployment. And again, so what does this mean? Essentially putting things together. It calls for a policy mix. It calls for a policy mix, essentially. So for the fact that in the data, you have people that are systematically different, the heterogeneity driving their persistence. So the persistence of unemployment we observe is driven by who they are, their differences. So this call obviously for a structural policy, or what we call a long-term policy. That may mean revisiting the curriculum, looking at people's attitude to work. But of course, there's room for short-term intervention. So the causal link we observe in the data is suggestive of the fact that short-term policies like wage subsidies, like job scheme creation, could actually also be effective, because there are people who are unemployed today simply because they were unemployed yesterday. So if we can break that initial unemployment at time t-1, they will escape unemployment at time t. So essentially, it calls for a policy mix, not just a single policy. Thank you. I think my time is almost up. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Godstime, for starting off the session, making us think about a much broader macro issue. So the third presentation that we have now is by Divya Pandey. She'll be talking about reinforcing gender norms or easing housework burdens, the role of mothers-in-law in determining women's labor force participation. So over to you, Divya, you have 15 minutes.
Hello, everyone. Today I'll be presenting my joint work with Madhulika Khanna, who's a research fellow at Evidence for Policy Design. In this paper, we examine the effects of intergenerational co-residence on women's labor supply decisions in India. Globally, women's labor force participation is 26.5 percentage points below that of men. Now, gender disparities in the labor market outcomes can be explained by two key channels. First, long-established gender roles that put a disproportionately higher burden of housework and childcare responsibilities on women. And in South Asia, women's labor force participation can be further inhibited by restrictive gender-specific social norms that inhibit women's autonomy as well as their bargaining power. A co-residing mother-in-law can affect both these channels in opposite directions. Therefore, the effect of a mother-in-law on women's labor supply decisions is ambiguous. In this paper, we examine which effect dominates to better understand women's labor supply decisions in the Indian context. In South Asia, family is a dynamic and complex concept. Joint families in which several generations co-reside are typical. Now, the nature of social norms in India is such that a family's honor and social status depends on its women's demeanor. Also, the nature of social norms is such that norms are more restrictive for younger women as well as women who belong to higher social status. Now, in a joint family, the mother-in-law heads the power hierarchy among the realms of tasks and responsibilities assigned to women. Mothers-in-law are given the role of gatekeepers of cultural norms. And to protect their family's honor, they restrict their daughter-in-law's bargaining power and mobility to ensure that the daughter-in-law adheres to her predefined role within the household as a caretaker and a caregiver, as well as she does not sully the family's image by venturing outside the home. Like I mentioned, women's movement outside the home for employment is often considered socially inappropriate, and the role of the mother-in-law is to make sure that the daughter-in-law does not sully the household's image. However, it wouldn't be right to reduce the mother-in-law, daughter-in-law relationship to a unidimensional portrayal of an essentially antagonistic relationship. The mother-in-law may actually help or encourage the daughter-in-law's labor force participation by, sharing their burden of housework responsibilities. Now, the mass popularity of Indian soap operas that portray a very complex mother-in-law, daughter-in-law love-hate relationship is a testament to the relevance of this relationship. Now, in this slide, the pictures show you, these pictures are from soap operas in this genre. And in fact, the very first picture is from a TV show that lasted for about a decade with about 2,000 episodes. And it shows 3 generations of mother-in-law, daughter-in-law pairs. This just goes to show how important this relationship is in the Indian setting. Now, in this paper, we examined the effect of the presence of a mother-in-law on women's labor supply decisions in India. Now, to answer this question, we use a nationally representative panel dataset and exploit the potentially exogenous variation in the death of the mother-in-law. Now, there are 2 key channels in isolating the effect of the mother-in-law on women's labor supply decisions in India. The first challenge is that the decision to live with the mother-in-law is endogenous. Now, whether a woman decides to live with her mother-in-law or not would depend on her priors about her beliefs that the mother-in-law would play in her life. So, for instance, if a woman strongly prefers to work and sees her mother-in-law as a potential help with housework and childcare responsibilities, may choose to live with her mother-in-law. However, if a woman sees her mother-in-law as a potential threat to her autonomy and bargaining power, may not choose to live with her mother-in-law. To address this concern, we use a sample in which the mother-in-law and the daughter-in-law co-reside at the baseline and then exploit the variation in the employment status of the daughter-in-law due to the mother-in-law's death. The next challenge to identification here would be that the mother-in-law's death could be non-random. There could be unobservables that are correlated with the daughter-in-law's employment status and the mother-in-law's death. Now, to address this concern, the longitudinal nature of our dataset allows us to use individual fixed effects. These control for any time invariant characteristics that are different across the groups whose mothers-in-law died between the survey rounds and the group whose mothers-in-law lived. Next, we also conduct a placebo test where we check the effect of the father-in-law's death on women's labor supply. And we find no effect of the father-in-law's death on the daughter-in-law's labor supply. This helps us alleviate further concerns about other socioeconomic factors driving our results. Now, there are 2 key channels through which the mother-in-law's death can affect the women's labor supply decisions. The first channel is the workload effect. Now, if the mother-in-law is sharing the housework burden of the daughter-in-law, after her death, this workload burden increases. And as a result, this could discourage her labor force participation rate. However, there's another key channel which affects women's labor supply after the mother-in-law's death, but it goes in the opposite direction of the workload effect. For instance, after the death of the mother-in-law, social norms become less restrictive, which could allow women to participate in the labor market by encouraging their mobility outside the home. Now, the ultimate effect of the mother-in-law's death on women's labor force participation would actually depend on which of the 2 counteracting channels dominate. Now, the key findings of our paper are that the mother-in-law's death reduces women's labor force participation by 4.6 percentage points, which is about 10% compared to the labor force participation of women whose mothers-in-law did not die. And this effect is monotonically increasing in the number of children. And This could be because women with more children have higher housework burdens, and as a result, they are more affected by any negative shock that increases their burden of household production tasks. Lastly, we also provide some suggestive evidence to show that after the mother-in-law's death, women spend more time on household production tasks. Now, for this analysis, we use data from the Indian Human Development Surveys. This is a 2-round longitudinal survey conducted in India in 2005 and 2012. In the longitudinal nature of this data allows us to identify mother-in-law, daughter-in-law pairs within a household across these two survey rounds spanning 7 years. It also allows us to identify cases where the mother-in-law died between the 2 survey rounds. In this survey, ever married women between ages 15 and 49 were interviewed on demographics, employment, and other themes relevant to this paper, such as time use and gender relations. The primary outcome variable in this paper is a binary variable equal to 1 if the woman was employed in that particular survey round. Now, this table shows the characteristics of women across 2 subgroups. The first subgroup consists of women whose mothers-in-law who did not live with their mothers-in-law at the baseline. And in the next column, we have women who lived with their mother-in-law at the baseline. If you notice, women who live with their mother-in-law versus women who do not live with their mother-in-law are different in every regard. So as I discussed earlier, to address this concern, we restrict our sample to women who were living with their mothers-in-law at the baseline. So our restricted sample consists of 7,541 daughter-in-law, mother-in-law pairs across 2,100 villages and neighborhoods in India, and the mother-in-law passed away in about 1,500 of these cases. Now, in this table, we compare the groups whose mothers-in-law died between the 2 survey rounds versus groups whose mothers-in-law lived. In the first column, we have the characteristics of women whose mothers-in-law lived between the 2 survey rounds. And in the second column, we have the characteristics of women whose mothers-in-law died between the 2 survey rounds. Again, there are some differences across the 2 subgroups. For example, the women whose mothers-in-law died were older. Also, they had higher financial autonomy. And finally, women whose mothers-in-law died between the 2 survey rounds had higher labor force participation. Now, for this analysis, we use our empirical strategy is that of a difference in differences approach along with individual fixed effects, which helps us to capture any unobservable time invariant differences between the groups whose mothers-in-law died versus whose mothers-in-law lived. Now, in this specification, our main outcome variable is the employment status of women I in survey round T. This could also be the time use or a measure of women of autonomy. The post is an indicator for the second survey round. Mother-in-law died is an indicator if woman I's mother-in-law died. Woman I's mother-in-law died between the 2 survey rounds. Delta I are individual fixed effects, which capture any differences between any time invariant differences between groups whose mothers-in-law died versus lived. We also have XIT, which is a time-varying woman's specific vector of controls, which consists of the number of children as well as the wealth of woman I, or the household wealth of woman I. And our main estimate or our key estimate of interest is beta 2, which is the differences in differences estimate. In this specification, we cluster our standard errors at the village or neighborhood level. Now I'll show you some patterns in the data that help you better understand our empirical strategy as well as the key results of this paper. In this graph shows that the average labor force participation declined between these 2 survey rounds in India. This is consistent with the conundrum of declining labor force participation in India. In this graph, the peach bar consists of groups whose mothers-in-law lived between the two survey rounds, and the blue bar represents the group whose mothers-in-law died between the survey rounds. So now the group whose mothers-in-law died between the two survey rounds had higher labor force participation rates. Finally, consistent with the previous graph, the peach bars represent women whose mothers-in-law lived, and the blue bars represent whose mothers-in-laws died. And here we compare women's labor force participation over time across the two subgroups. Now, if you notice that consistent with the previous graphs, women's labor force participation declined for both the subgroups across the two survey rounds. Next, labor force participation rates of women whose mothers-in-law died is consistently higher compared to the group whose mothers-in-law did not die between the two survey rounds. Finally, the decline in the labor force participation of women whose mothers-in-law died is steeper compared to women whose mothers-in-law did not die. This is the key result of our paper and also summarizes our empirical strategy. Next, I'll present our results from our empirical strategy of a difference in differences approach along with individual fixed effects. Now, in this table, the first column shows that after the mother-in-law's death, women's labor force participation declined by 4.6 percentage points. Compared to the baseline mean, this is a 10% effect. In the next column, we look at the effect of the mother-in-law's death on women's labor force participation by time elapsed since death. Now, in the second column, if you notice that the effect is the most prominent right after the mother-in-law's death. This test helps us to check whether the effect of the mother-in-law's death accumulates over time or women adjust to the initial shock of the loss. So here we see that the effects are the most prominent right after the death, and over time they are absent. So this just goes to show that women adjust to the initial shock. Now, to better understand the economic significance of our results and put our results in perspective, I'll compare our estimates to estimates found by other studies. Now, providing recruiting services in India encouraged women's labor force participation by 2.4 percentage points. In the US, birth control pills encouraged women's labor force participation by 3 percentage points. In South Africa, electrification encouraged women's employment rates by 9 percentage points. It is worth noting that our estimate of a 4.6 percentage point decline due to the mother-in-law's death lies within the range of estimates found by other studies. Next, to establish the validity.
Divya, you have 1 more minute, sorry.
Next, to establish the validity of our estimates, I look at the effect of the father-in-law's death on women's labor force participation. The effect of the father-in-law's death on women's labor force participation is small and insignificant. Now, the key mechanism driving our results is indeed the increased burden of housework and childcare responsibilities, which I'll show you next. Now, this figure shows that the effect on women's labor force participation after the mother-in-law's death is monotonically increasing in the number of children. Women with more children presumably have higher housework burdens and as a result are more negatively affected by any shock that increases this. Finally, I'll show you that women end up that it is indeed the increased housework burden that drives our key results. So in this table, the first column shows that after the mother-in-law's death, women spend about 4.4 minutes more collecting water, and the next column shows that they spend about 18 more minutes collecting fuel, which again is in favor of our mechanism that after the mother-in-law's death, women's housework burdens increase, and as a result, their labor force participation decreases. To summarize, our paper sheds light on the low female labor force participation in a large and growing developing economy context like India, where education gaps have reduced, and it has been showing economic growth. And there has also been fertility declines. So our findings highlight the importance of policies that ease women's housework burdens and childcare responsibilities in encouraging their labor force participation. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Divya. This was fascinating. We'll now go to the audience for the questions. You can keep posting them, and the panelists and speakers, if you have questions for each other, you also please feel free to indicate that. We'll first go to Martin Tebe-Ojong, who I believe has a question for Godstime. We'll unmute you if you can ask your question live now, please. Martin, please go ahead.
Oh, thank you very much. So thank you very much, Godstime, for the very good presentation. Something I was wondering about was the fact that I possibly missed a discussion on your attrition effects and how this kind of bias your results, because you kept on talking about using the balance panel data set. But I understand that over the years there must have been some level of attrition. How do you think this kind of biases your results? Also, I'm looking at the fact that, okay, based on these initial conditions, when you're using these dynamic panel models, there's always this issue of endogeneity, and you mentioned how you controlled for that. But if I'm not very wrong, I think that most of the methods we're using were kind of fairly restrictive. How do you also think that kind of influences your results at the final end? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Martin. Yes, so attrition is of course a very big concern in most panel analysis, and so yeah, of course I'm concerned. But what I did is using both the balance. So I'm running with a fundamental assumption that attrition is missing at random. That's MAR. So I'm assuming attrition is missing at random. Then what gives me that confidence is, of course, if that is the case, if attrition is missing at random, I expect the results from the balance panel not to be significantly different from the results from the balance panel. And so if you look at my results, so what I saw in the results shows that the results across estimations are largely similar. So there's no significant difference between the result from the balance panel and the unbalanced panel. So that is a bit reassuring that attrition may indeed be missing at random. But of course, that's not enough. I know ideally I'm supposed to use the Heckman type test to check formally. My problem with that is the strong assumption I have to make. So yeah, so that's actually what I did. I didn't do more than that by simply comparing the two results. I'm not saying that is enough, to be frank, but the Heckman format and the former Heckman type test will require me to make some more realistic assumptions around my data. To your second question, you talked about if my estimations are restrictive. Though I'm not sure I understand what you mean by restrictive. So could you, restrictive in the sense of?
So basically, I understand you use this Woodridge techniques and this Rabe techniques as well, but I basically think they are kind of fairly restrictive, because in a way they will not critically control for endogeneity, especially in the initial conditions. So I'm just asking how you think that also kind of balances, kind of biases your results. But also back to the first question, you mustn't just use the Heckman, because possibly you can also just test whether attrition is even a problem by just specifying some basic attrition probits. Then if it's a problem, then is it correct for using this inverse probability weights of something? Yeah. Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks, Martin. I'm not sure. Let me just quickly respond. Yes, so the method suggested by Woodridge refined in 2013, it's not perfect as it were, but it gives us something close enough to account simultaneously for the initial condition and unobserved heterogeneity. Yes, there are some assumptions that underpinning the original paper Woodridge wrote in 2005 is sort of the closest I'm able to get to. And finally, on the issue of attrition, yes, I agree. There are basic tests I can do which is something I could think along after now. So thank you very much.
I will go next to Louise Fox, I think, who has a question once again for Godstime. Louise, please go ahead.
Hi, Godstime. Interesting paper, really interesting. And thank you for such a thorough analysis. But I was a little surprised to see that job experience was left out. I mean, what distinguishes youth from adults is that lack of job experience. And so I would have thought that would go in. It would also, it's observable, right? So, and also household poverty seems to be the most important variable, which may be partly determining the unobservable. So I wonder if you have a comment on that. And finally, are not IQ and education correlates? So you really have a combined effect there that is quite strong, right? Thank you.
All right, thank you so much for these wonderful questions. So yes, so I mean, I saw the questions and the comment section, so I quickly ran back to my results, and I was surprised that I don't have job experience there. Because I remember when I was doing the data collation, I thought I actually have experience, years of experience, which I think is the data. So thanks for pointing that out. I think I will have to take that back to the estimation. Like you mentioned, it's a very important variable. And so concerning the household poverty, possibly explaining the unobserved. Yeah, I never thought of that really. And looking at the results, indeed, is quite significant. And so I'm just thinking about it now, to be frank. So the possibility that, so poverty is actually, so yeah, I never thought of that, to be frank. So going back to the results, I have seen that that could actually be a possibility, and which I will have to account for that in some way. So thanks again for that point. And yeah, to the last one, the difference between the, education and IQ. So the way why I thought of, I felt the correlation is somewhat weak, especially in a developing country context, where years of education doesn't necessarily reflect much learning for you as a tutor. So the measure of IQ was actually done at the beginning of the survey. So sort of a way to approximate innate ability. That's the whole essence. I dropped it there because it was a special test that was administered at the beginning of the survey in 2002. Then years of education, I felt was just the number of years you've spent. So I felt the correlation is weak. Both should go in independently. So again, I'm thinking now if the correlation is strong enough, which will require me to not to combine both. Again, I mean, you've given me a lot to think about. So I will have to go back and think about all this. Thanks so much. Thank you.
Paul Brimble has a question for Divya next.
Hello. Hi, Divya. Thank you very much for your presentation. My question was on what mechanisms do you think drive your result that the death of a mother-in-law only leads to a short-term drop in sort of female labor force participation? Do you think this could be that the two effects that you outlined, the autonomy effect and sort of the household work effect, sort of impact a woman at different time sort of horizons? Specifically, that one could imagine that a death would have a very short-term impact on the housework, while the autonomy effect might take more time, and that could be masking why we see no long-term impacts. What do you think?
So we did examine the effects of the mother-in-law on women's autonomy outcomes. So the survey asked questions like, do they need permission to visit the local grocery store? Do they need permission to visit their friends? But we do not find any significant effect on autonomy outcomes of women after the mother-in-law's death. Of course, social norms are really sticky, and this could take some time to change because there's a chance that there are other mechanisms at play. It's likely that after the mother-in-law's death, the father-in-law is still living in the household. So he becomes the flag bearer of social norms. Or it could also be through channels of marriage, like the husband's attitude, how does that change after his mother passes away? So I think social norms would be a little more complicated in this context. But yeah, right after the mother-in-law's death, we do not see any effects on the autonomy outcomes or norms within the household as well. For instance, we do not see any changes in patterns of who eats first. So the survey asks questions, do men eat first in the household, or do you have to cover your head? So the parda system in South Asia, where women have to cover their faces and heads in front of older family members or other men, those patterns do not significantly change after the mother-in-law's death. Does that answer your question?
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ola, I think, had a question from Divya, which has already been answered about if decision-making outcomes, and particularly agency, changes over time. But Divya said that there's actually no change in agency-related outcomes after the mother-in-law's death. So thank you for that, Divya, and thank you, everyone. We're out of time, unfortunately, but I'm sure all speakers, your presentations would have given everybody a lot of food for thought, and we can continue these discussions hopefully offline. I'd like to thank the audience and everyone for their questions. Please do join us in 30 minutes for the final session of the Labor Day, which is on effects of shocks on labor market outcomes. So thank you, and look forward to seeing you shortly.